All right, welcome to another deep dive. And today we're going to be talking about a case that's both fascinating and, really heartbreaking. The death of Scott Johnson.
Yeah, it's a really compelling case. And for those who aren't familiar, Scott Johnson was an American mathematician, brilliant guy, found dead at the bottom of some cliffs in Australia back in 1988.
Yeah, and initially the police, they ruled it a suicide. Open and shut case, they thought. But his brother Steve, he never believed that. He just knew in his gut there was more to the story.
One of the things that really strikes me about this whole case is just how much Steve's determination really drove everything forward. I mean, he just refused to accept that easy answer.
Yeah, absolutely. He spent decades, literally decades, fighting to uncover the truth. It's amazing, and I think for a lot of our listeners, it begs the question, what would you do if you were in his shoes?
It really does make you think. If you had a loved one die under suspicious circumstances, and it just felt like the investigation wasn't thorough, like they weren't really looking.
Exactly, and that's what we're diving into today, the whole story of Scott Johnson and his brother's incredible fight for justice. We're taking a deep dive into this true crime podcast episode that goes, really deep into the weeds.
Yeah, and it's a case that really makes you think about how, you know, prejudice, even unconscious bias, can impact these kinds of investigations, how quickly they can jump to conclusions.
Absolutely. So let's start at the beginning. With the initial police investigation, what did they do? What did they find?
Well, to put it bluntly, the initial investigation was really superficial. Like, they didn't really do much digging at all. They kind of just focused on the location, the cliffs where Scott's body was found.
Okay, and what was significant about that location?
Well, these cliffs, they were unfortunately known as a spot where gay men would sometimes, take their own lives. It was a tragic reality at the time.
Right, and so the police, they just assumed that Scott's death fit that pattern. They didn't really consider other possibilities.
Pretty much, yeah. They spoke to his partner, they talked to one professor, but that was about it. They didn't really delve into Scott's life, his relationships, any potential threats, anything like that.
Wow. And this is 1988, right? We're not talking about the dark ages here. It just seems so negligent.
It really does. And to make matters worse, get this, they actually lost the case file.
Wait, they lost the whole file. Seriously?
Yep, the whole thing just disappeared, which just kind of speaks to the level of, you know, carelessness, I guess you could say.
It's almost unbelievable. No wonder Steve was suspicious from the get-go.
Yeah, I mean, he knew right away that something wasn't right.
Yeah.
He started asking these tough questions like, did they check Scott's phone records? Did they talk to his friends? Did they find his wallet? Which he always carried.
What did they say?
They had no answers, which of course just made Steve even more determined to find out what really
It's
happened.
good for him. It's like they were almost relieved to just label it a suicide and move on.
Yeah, you get that sense. But Steve wasn't going to let that happen. So he started doing his own investigation, documenting everything, building his own case file.
Wow, that's amazing. I mean, he was just a regular guy, not a detective or anything. He really went above and beyond.
Absolutely. He even managed to get Senator Ted Kennedy involved through like a family connection or something. Talk about pulling out all the stops.
Wow. And did that help? Did having Ted Kennedy on board make a difference?
Well, it helped get an inquest started, which, for anyone who's not familiar with the Australian legal system, an inquest is basically a formal inquiry to determine the cause of death.
Ah, okay. Gotcha. So that was a big step forward, right? To have an official inquiry into Scott's death.
It was a step, but unfortunately it didn't change the outcome. The inquest also ruled Scott's death a suicide.
So Steve was back to square one.
In a way, yeah. But he still refused to give up. He just knew in his heart that something wasn't right.
You gotta admire his tenacity, right? He never gave up hope.
Exactly. And you have to think about the emotional toll this must have taken on him. Imagine living with that kind of unresolved grief for years. It's incredible that he kept going.
It really is. And then, after all those years of searching, he finally got a little bit of a break. A glimmer of hope. In 2005, he received a letter from Scott's partner, Michael.
Oh, right, the letter.
Yeah.
Yeah, and in that letter, Michael mentioned that there were new investigations happening into the deaths of other gay men around the same time and place as Scott's death.
So there was a possibility that these cases were connected, that Scott wasn't the only victim.
Exactly. And wouldn't you feel a surge of hope if you were Steve? After all those years, finally a new lead, a potential connection to other cases.
Absolutely. It's like a door finally opening after all that time.
It was. But here's the thing. The police, they were still really resistant to reopening the case, even with this new information.
Seriously, why? What was their reasoning?
It's hard to say for sure, but it seems like they were just really stuck on their initial conclusion, like they didn't want to admit they might have been wrong.
That's infuriating. I mean, how can you be so resistant to new information? Especially when it could potentially lead to solving multiple cases.
It's a good question, but that's the reality Steve was facing. The police just weren't budging.
So what did he do?
Well, at that point, Steve realized he couldn't rely on the police to get to the truth. So he decided to hire an investigative journalist named Dan Glick.
Ah, so he brought in a professional, someone who knew how to dig for information.
Exactly. And Dan had this really smart approach. He knew that to understand what happened to Scott, he had to understand the social context of the time. So he immersed himself in the gay community, talking to people, learning about their experiences.
That's really interesting. It's like he was trying to understand the world Scott lived in, the dangers he might have faced.
Precisely. And it was through these conversations that Dan uncovered a crucial piece of information. The cliffs where Scott was found, they weren't just any cliffs. They were a known beat.
A beat. What's that?
It was a slang term at the time for a place where gay men would meet, usually in secret, often secluded areas like parks or, in this case, cliffs.
Ah, okay. So it wasn't just a random tragic location. It was a place where gay men gathered, which means that Scott could have been targeted specifically because he was gay.
Exactly. It shifts the whole perspective of the case, doesn't it? Suddenly, the possibility of a hate crime becomes much more likely.
It's chilling, really, knowing that this wasn't just a random suicide, but a potential act of violence.
It is. And to understand the full gravity of that, we have to remember the social context of Australia in the late 80s. Homosexuality had only recently been decriminalized. There was still a lot of prejudice, a lot of violence directed at gay men.
Right, so this wasn't just a theoretical possibility. There was a very real danger for gay men at that time.
Absolutely. And there were even reports of gangs that specifically targeted gay men at beats. It was a very dangerous time.
Wow. That just adds another layer of complexity and tragedy to this whole story, knowing that Scott could have been a victim of this kind of targeted violence.
It does. And just when it seemed like the case had reached a dead end, something really bizarre happened in 2011. A Facebook post appeared claiming responsibility for Scott's murder.
A Facebook confession? Really? That seems a bit strange.
It was. And you won't be surprised to hear that it turned out to be a hoax. Someone just trying to stir up trouble.
Of course. But I'm curious, what was the reaction to this hoax? Did it have any impact on the case?
It did, actually. And this is where things get a little bit ironic. Remember the coroner, the official who investigates suspicious deaths?
Yeah.
Well, the coroner, who had been pretty reluctant to do anything about Scott's case for years, suddenly jumped into action after this Facebook post surfaced.
So even though it was fake, this hoax confession actually managed to bring renewed attention to the case?
Exactly. It kind of backfired on the person who posted it. They thought they were just messing around, but they ended up helping to move the investigation forward.
That's amazing. Sometimes even a hoax can have unintended consequences.
It can. And in this case, those consequences were actually positive.
So what happened next? Did this renewed attention finally lead to some breakthroughs?
It did, but not in the way anyone expected. It did, but not in the way anyone expected. Thanks to the pressure created by the hoax and Steve's continued advocacy, a second inquest was held in 2012.
Ah, so a second look at the case. What happened this time?
Well, this time the coroner returned an open finding, meaning they couldn't definitively say it was a suicide.
Okay, so that's a small victory for Steve Wright. After all these years of fighting, at least an acknowledgement that maybe, just maybe, the initial investigation was wrong.
It was a victory, yeah, but a frustrating one. The case was then referred to the Unsolved Homicide Unit.
Okay, and
they basically told Steve, look, it's going to be years before we can even get to this. They had a massive backlog of cases.
oh man, talk about a letdown. So close, yet so far.
It was tough, yeah. And to add insult to injury, they actually gave Scott's case a low solvability score.
Really? A low solvability score? What does that even mean?
It basically means they didn't think they were going to be able to solve it. Like they weren't even going to try that hard.
Oh, come on. That's just demoralizing. After all that, to be told, yeah, we don't think we can solve this. Don't get your hopes up.
You can imagine how Steve felt.
Hmm.
But he refused to be discouraged. He thought, okay, fine, if they won't take this seriously, I'll make them.
So what did he do? Did he, like, hire a private investigator or something?
He went even bigger. He decided to launch a full-blown media campaign.
Wow. The power of the press.
Exactly. He knew the public pressure could be incredibly effective, so he started sending out binders full of information to all the officials. He got an episode on Australian Story, which is a big TV show down there.
Oh, yeah, I've heard of that.
It's a really popular show. And they did a whole episode on Scott's case, which really highlighted the police bias and the way the investigation had been handled.
Wow, that's powerful. Putting it all out there in the public eye.
It was. And it worked. The public outcry was so huge that the police were basically forced to create a task force specifically to investigate Scott's death.
All right, finally, some real progress. It only took, what, 20-something years?
Yeah, it was a long time coming.
Yeah.
But, things are rarely straightforward, especially in a case like this.
Uh-oh. What happened?
So they form this task force, right? And they bring in this new lead investigator, Pam Young.
Okay. New investigator, fresh perspective.
You'd think so, right?
Yeah.
But Pam, she had this very, by-the-book approach. She was all about fairness to all victims, which, don't get me wrong, that's important.
Yeah, of course.
But she just didn't seem that interested in the work Steve and Dan had done.
Really? After all that effort they put in?
Yeah. She was even kind of dismissive of their findings. Like, there were reports of her laughing during their presentation.
Wow, that's just disrespectful. I mean, these guys had dedicated years of their lives to this case, and she's laughing.
It was a really tense dynamic. And, when you have that kind of tension between the people who are supposed to be working together, it's not going to be conducive to finding the truth.
No, it's definitely not. So what happened? Did Pam Young's investigation just go nowhere?
Well, she spent years digging into the case, going through all the evidence, talking to people, and eventually she released this massive report, like 450 pages long.
450 pages? That's a lot of reading.
It was. And her conclusion?
Drum roll, please.
Suicide.
What? Are you serious? After all that, after all the new information, all the work Steve and Dan had done, she still concluded it was suicide.
Yep, back to square one.
Unbelievable. Did she at least acknowledge the possibility of a hate crime?
She didn't. In fact, her report went even further. She actually suggested that Steve's alleged disapproval of Scott's sexuality might have contributed to Scott's decision to take his own life.
Hold on. She's blaming Steve after all he's done to try to clear his brother's name?
It was a pretty shocking claim. And of course, Steve completely denied it. He was furious, rightfully so. He saw it as a deliberate attempt to discredit him, to punish him for rocking the boat, for bringing so much attention to the case.
It's crazy, right? It's like they just couldn't accept the possibility that they had made a mistake all those years ago.
It does seem that way. And,
Yeah.
a lot of people felt that Pam Young's report was vindictive. Like she was trying to get back at Steve and Dan for their independent investigation.
So after all that, it felt like they were right back where they started. Case closed, suicide ruling, and now with Steve's reputation being smeared.
It was a dark time.
Yeah.
But remember, we're talking about Steve Johnson here, the guy who refused to give up. He wasn't about to let this stand.
So what happened next? Did he appeal the report or something?
Well, he couldn't really appeal the report itself, but he could appeal to something much more powerful, public opinion.
Ah, the court of public opinion. That's a powerful force.
It is. And in this case, it was the key to everything. The outcry over Pam Young's report was so huge, so widespread, that it led to something truly unprecedented.
What's that?
A third inquest.
A third inquest. Seriously, I mean, don't those usually just happen once?
They do, yeah. It's
Yeah.
incredibly rare to have a third inquest. But this case was just that extraordinary. The public pressure was too much to ignore.
Wow, that's amazing. So Steve's media campaign, it actually worked. He got the authorities to take another look at the case.
He did. And this third inquest, it took place in 2017. And to really understand the significance of what happened, we need to remember the broader context of Australia in 2017.
Okay, so what was happening in Australia at that time?
Well, remember how homosexuality was only decriminalized in the late 80s?
Yeah.
Well, in 2017, Australia was on the verge of another major social change: the legalization of same-sex marriage.
Right. That was a huge moment, not just for Australia, but for LGBTQ plus rights around the world.
It was. And I think there's a real connection between that movement for marriage equality and the renewed attention on Scott Johnson's case.
Interesting. So you're saying that Scott's story, this fight for justice, it might have actually contributed to the momentum for marriage equality.
I think it did. Because suddenly you had this case that was all over the media, this story about a gay man who might have been murdered just for being who he was.
Yeah, it kind of puts a face on the issue, doesn't it? Makes it harder to ignore.
Exactly. And, the fact that Scott was a brilliant scientist, a loving brother, it really humanized the issue.
It's not just some abstract debate about rights. It's about real people, real lives, real families who are affected by this kind of prejudice and violence.
That's exactly right.
Hmm.
And I think that realization, that sense of urgency, it played a role in shifting public opinion and creating the momentum for change.
That's powerful. So you have this backdrop of social progress, this movement for equality, and then you have this third inquest, this final chance to get justice for Scott.
It was a pivotal moment. And the coroner, after reviewing all the evidence, they came to a landmark ruling.
Okay, tell me, what did they decide?
They ruled that Scott Johnson was most likely murdered in a hate crime.
Finally. After all those years of fighting, Steve was finally vindicated.
He was. And the coroner also pointed to something that had been overlooked before, Scott's missing wallet.
Ah, so a possible motive for the crime. Robbery.
Exactly. It seems like Scott might have been targeted not just for being gay, but also because he was perceived as vulnerable, someone who might be carrying cash.
So they finally acknowledged that Scott was murdered, and they even have a potential motive. This must have been a huge turning point in the case.
It was, and remember, this ruling came just days before same-sex marriage was legalized in Australia. It was almost like a symbolic moment, like justice was finally prevailing on both a personal and a societal level.
Wow, that's incredible. So does that mean the case was finally closed? They knew Scott was murdered, they had a potential motive, but did they ever find the person who actually did it?
Well, that's where things get even more interesting. Because even with this ruling, even with the acknowledgement of a hate crime, they still didn't know who killed Scott. The fight for justice wasn't over yet. It was. The New South Wales police, they were under a lot of pressure after that third inquest. They knew they had to find Scott's killer.
Right, they couldn't just sweep it under the rug anymore.
Exactly. So they reopened the case, and they assigned Detective Peter Yeomans to lead the investigation.
Okay, new detective, new energy. Was there anything different about Detective Yeoman's approach?
Well, for one thing, he was much more collaborative. He actually recognized the value of the work Steve and Dan had done.
Ah, so finally some acknowledgement that they weren't just, meddling outsiders.
Right. Detective Yeomans, he really seemed to understand that they had this unique perspective on the case. Like, they knew things that the police didn't.
That makes sense. They'd been living and breathing this case for decades.
Exactly. And Detective Yeomans, he was smart. He knew he needed their help to solve it.
So what did he do? Did he, officially bring them on to the investigation team or something?
Well, he did something pretty dramatic. He increased the reward for information to $1 million. And then Steve matched it.
Whoa. $2 million? That's a lot of money.
It is. It was a huge gamble. But they knew they had to do something big to get people talking.
So did they have any leads at that point? Any specific suspects they were looking at?
Well, remember that list of potential suspects Steve and Dan had put together?
Yeah.
One of those names was Scott White. He was the brother of a guy they had interviewed years earlier.
Okay, so Scott White was on their radar, but they didn't have enough to connect him to the crime.
Right. But now, with this huge reward out there, they thought maybe someone would come forward with new information.
So they just put all their eggs in one basket, focused everything on this one guy.
Pretty much. And Detective Yeomans, he encouraged Steve to make a very public statement, like to go on TV and say they had a single suspect in mind.
Whoa, that's bold. I mean, what if they were wrong?
It was a risk, but a calculated one. They knew this kind of public announcement would put a lot of pressure on anyone who might know something about Scott White.
Yeah, guilt them into coming forward or something.
Maybe. But either way, it worked. Someone did come forward.
Who was it?
It was Scott White's ex-wife, Helen.
His ex-wife? Wow, I did not see that coming.
It was a huge break in the case. Helen, she had actually read an article about Scott Johnson's death back in 2008, and she'd asked her husband at the time, Scott White, if he had anything to do with it.
And what did he say?
He didn't deny it. He just said that Scott Johnson had run off the cliff.
Huh.
But Helen, she didn't believe him. She always suspected that he'd pushed him.
That's chilling. But if she suspected him back then, why didn't she come forward sooner?
She was terrified of her husband. She said he had threatened to kill her if she ever told anyone.
Oh, wow. So she only felt safe coming forward after they had separated.
Right. It's a sad reminder that sometimes victims or witnesses are just too afraid to speak up.
Absolutely. It takes a lot of courage to come forward, especially when you're dealing with something like domestic violence.
It does. And the police, They knew they had to handle this very carefully. They couldn't just go and arrest Scott White based on his ex-wife's suspicions. They needed more.
So what did they do?
They set up an undercover operation. They sent undercover officers posing as reward seekers to befriend Scott White.
Oh, I love a good undercover operation.
This one was pretty clever. The officers, they managed to gain Scott White's trust, and eventually he started talking about the night Scott Johnson died.
Did he confess?
He did. He actually led the officers to the exact spot where Scott Johnson went over the cliff. He described punching Scott in the face, and he admitted to stealing wallets from other gay men he had attacked in the past.
Wow. He basically confessed to everything.
He did. But then, later on, when he realized he had been tricked, he tried to recant his confession. Said he was confused, stressed out.
Oh, come on. The classic, I didn't know what I was saying, excuse?
Yeah, right. But it didn't work. The recordings were too clear. He had given up too many details that only the killer could have known.
So justice was finally served.
It was. In 2022, Scott White was found guilty of murder and sentenced to 12 years in prison.
Wow. After all those years, Steve finally got justice for his brother. That must have been an incredible moment.
It was. But, it wasn't a perfect victory. Scott White's sentence was later reduced to 9 years on appeal.
Oh, really? Why was that?
Well, the court took into account things like his cognitive impairment, his troubled upbringing.
So they were saying he wasn't fully responsible for his actions?
Something like that, yeah. It's a complex issue. On the one hand, it's important to consider the circumstances that might have led someone to commit a crime. But on the other hand, it can feel like a slap in the face to the victim's family when a sentence is reduced.
I can definitely see both sides of that. So what happened to Steve? Did he just, walk away after Scott White was convicted?
Not at all. Steve, he's become a real advocate for other families of victims of anti-gay violence. A lot of those cases, they're still unsolved.
Right. There were probably a lot of Scott Johnsons out there, people whose deaths were just written off as suicides.
Exactly. And Steve's determined to make sure those cases aren't forgotten.
Yeah.
He's written a lot about his experience, encouraging other families to keep fighting to demand answers.
That's really inspiring. It would have been so easy for him to just walk away after all those years, but he chose to use his experience to help others.
He did. And he's also been really vocal about the need for better investigations into these kinds of cases.
Yeah.
To really make sure they're looking at all the possibilities, not just jumping to conclusions because of someone's sexuality.
Yeah, that's so important, especially back then when homophobia was so prevalent.
Absolutely. And, even today, we still see these kinds of biases, these assumptions about LGBTQ plus people that can really affect how cases are investigated.
It's a good reminder that even though we've come a long way, there's still a lot of work to be done to ensure that everyone gets equal treatment under the law.
That's exactly right.
Well, this has been a truly incredible deep dive. I mean, we've covered so much ground here. The twists and turns of the investigation, the legal battles, the personal tragedies, the societal changes. It's just an amazing story.
It really is. It's a story about loss, about prejudice, about the feelings of the justice system. But it's also a story about perseverance, about love, about the power of one person to make a difference.
And I think for our listeners, there's a lot to take away from this. I mean, it really makes you think about the importance of speaking out against injustice, of fighting for what you believe in, even when it seems like all hope is lost.
Absolutely, because you never know. Your actions might just spark a change that ripples out far beyond your own life.
Well said. And on that note, we want to thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the extraordinary case of Scott Johnson. We hope you found it as compelling and thought-provoking as we did.
And remember, if you're interested in learning more about this case or about the broader issue of hate crimes against the LGBTQ plus community, we'll have some resources linked in the show notes.
Thanks for listening.